This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Always exciting to be back.
So today we're going to be jumping back in time to the years between 1933 and 1941.
Oh.
That crucial period just before the U.S. entered World War II.
Yeah.
You might think of it as like this, black and white history reel.
Right.
But hold on tight, because this era is absolutely packed with decisions and global shifts that I think are going to surprise you.
Absolutely.
And that still echo today, in fact.
Yeah, you might be shocked to learn just how isolationist the U.S. was back then.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, imagine this. They were still reeling from the horrors of World War I.
Right.
The last thing anyone wanted,
of course,
was to get entangled in another European conflict.
Yeah. So while Europe was gearing up for another round, the U.S. was basically saying, nope, not our problem.
Pretty much, yeah. This sentiment ran deep.
Okay.
In fact, to really get a grasp on this, we're diving into excerpts from an IB history podcast by Mr. Hutchings.
Okay.
He's going to be our guide through this complex period.
All right, so we've got the U.S. wanting to stay out of Europe's mess, but how did that actually play out?
Well, it wasn't just a feeling. They turned this isolationist attitude into concrete actions. Think about the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, meant to officially end World War I.
Yeah.
The U.S. Senate, get this, actually rejected it.
Wow, they straight up said no to the peace treaty.
They did.
Why?
Yeah, it's a great question. There was a lot of debate at the time.
Right.
But a key factor was this deep-seated distrust of international commitments.
Okay.
They didn't want to be bound by agreements that could drag them into future conflicts.
I see. So they were prioritizing their own interests and security above all else.
Exactly. And that rejection of the Treaty of Versailles really set the tone for the next 2 decades.
Wow.
It's a powerful example of just how committed the U.S. was to staying out of international affairs.
Okay, so the U.S. wasn't just being cautious. They were making a statement like, we do things our own way.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just the treaty, right? They took a step further.
They also decided not to join the League of Nations.
Oh.
This was Woodrow Wilson's big idea for a global peacekeeping organization, a way to prevent future wars.
Right.
But the U.S. decided to go it alone.
So even when presented with a seemingly good idea for peace, they stuck to their isolationist guns.
Absolutely. And this isolationist approach extended to military matters as well.
Okay.
Take the Washington Naval Conference in the early 1920s.
Yeah.
The goal was to limit naval construction.
Okay.
Basically a way to prevent a future arms race and hopefully avoid another devastating war.
Interesting. So they were taking steps to reduce their own military footprint on the world stage.
They were.
But I bet that didn't last forever.
You're right. Things started to shift in the 1930s when the world witnessed the rise of fascism in Europe.
Yeah, here we go.
Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, suddenly the stakes were much higher.
So how did the U.S. react to this growing threat? Did they abandon their isolationist stance right away?
Not quite. Their initial response was actually pretty measured.
Okay.
A good example is President Roosevelt's famous quarantine speech in 1937.
Right.
He condemned the spread of authoritarianism, but stopped short of calling for direct intervention.
So he acknowledged the danger, but wasn't ready to commit to action.
Precisely. Remember, public opinion in the U.S. was still strongly isolationist.
Right.
Roosevelt had to tread carefully. He couldn't just suddenly flip a switch and declare war.
Yeah, it's like watching a pot slowly come to a boil. Yeah. Something's about to happen, but it takes time.
A good analogy, and then came a pivotal moment, the Munich Agreement in 1938.
Uh-oh.
This was when Britain and France tried to appease Hitler by giving him a region of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland.
Ah, appeasement history doesn't exactly paint that in a good light.
Yeah.
How did this play out?
Well, the hope was that by giving Hitler what he wanted, they could prevent a larger war. But as we know now, it didn't work.
Right.
Hitler just saw it as weakness and became even more emboldened.
Okay, so a major miscalculation on the part of Britain and France, but where does the U.S. fit into this?
Publicly, Roosevelt had to stick to the official policy of neutrality.
Right.
But privately, he was deeply concerned about the implications of the Munich Agreement.
Okay.
He saw it as a dangerous concession to Hitler and worried about what it meant for the future of Europe and ultimately for the U.S.
So behind the scenes, there's a growing sense of unease, right? Like this appeasement thing isn't working, and we might need to rethink our approach.
Exactly. And this is where we see the U.S. starting to make some subtle but significant shifts in its policy.
Well,
In 1939, they added a new provision to the Neutrality Act called cash and carry.
hold on, cash and carry. What's that all about?
It essentially allowed them to sell arms to Britain and France, but with specific conditions.
Okay.
Those countries had to pay in cash and transport the weapons themselves.
Okay.
No U.S. involvement in the actual fighting.
Ah, I get it. So still technically neutral, but definitely lending a helping hand to the countries fighting against Hitler. It's a fine line, isn't it?
Very fun. And it's something that historians have debated for years.
Oh, I bet.
Was this a genuine attempt to stay neutral or a calculated move towards eventual involvement in the war?
Yeah.
We have different schools of thought on this.
Okay, let's dive into those different perspectives. We've got to unravel this historical mystery. Who are the key players in this debate?
Well, for starters, you have the Revisionist school.
Okay.
They argue that even Roosevelt's seemingly limited actions were strategically laying the groundwork for eventual U.S. involvement in the war.
So they're saying he was playing a bit of a long game, like, let's keep up appearances, but we're secretly prepping for something bigger.
That's a great way to put it, and they point to things like the Lend-Lease Act of 1941 as evidence.
Okay.
This was a huge turning point because it allowed the U.S. to directly provide military aid to Britain, no strings attached.
Wow, that's a major departure from cash and carry. It sounds like the U.S. was edging closer and closer to war, even though they hadn't officially joined the fight yet.
Exactly, and this raises a fascinating question.
Oh, well,
What is the public's take on all of this? Were they ready to jump into another war?
that's a great question. I can't imagine everyone was on board with this shift. Were there still folks clinging to the isolationist ideal?
Oh, absolutely. Even after Germany invaded Poland in 1939, officially starting World War II, a lot of Americans were still fiercely opposed to U.S. involvement.
Wow.
And even with the fall of France in 1940, this sentiment remained strong.
So Roosevelt had to walk this tightrope, balancing his understanding of the global threat with the deeply ingrained isolationist feelings of a large portion of the American public.
It was a delicate balancing act, for sure, and this tension is perfectly exemplified by groups like the America First Committee, led by figures like Charles Lindbergh.
Right.
They argued passionately that America's focus should be on defending its own hemisphere, not getting entangled in another European war.
That classic isolationism versus interventionism debate, right? It seems to be a recurring theme throughout history.
Yeah.
But where does Roosevelt truly stand in all of this? Was he truly an isolationist at heart?
That's where the historian William Lichtenberg comes in with his idea of pragmatic internationalism. He argued that Roosevelt, while cautious, understood that U.S. security was ultimately intertwined with the fate of Europe. He knew isolationism couldn't work forever.
So not a diehard isolationist, but a pragmatist, someone who saw the world becoming more interconnected and the U.S.'s role within it. Like, we can't just pretend these conflicts don't affect us.
Exactly, and the Lend-Lease Act really highlights this shift. It was a decisive break from isolationism and a clear signal that the U.S. was becoming, as Roosevelt put it, the arsenal of democracy.
That's a powerful image, the U.S. supplying the weapons and resources to defend democracy against the rising tide of fascism.
It was a defining moment in U.S. foreign policy, and it's a perfect illustration of how Roosevelt, a master strategist, was able to navigate complex public opinion while taking concrete steps to prepare the U.S. for a larger role on the world stage.
Okay, so we've got the U.S. slowly but surely being drawn into the conflict in Europe, driven by a combination of global events and strategic decisions. But there's another piece of the puzzle we need to explore, Japan's growing aggression in Asia.
Absolutely. While all this was happening in Europe, a parallel crisis was brewing in Asia, one that would ultimately have a profound impact on the U.S. and the course of the war.
Yeah, it's easy to get so caught up in the European theater.
Right.
But the situation in Asia was just as volatile.
Right.
Japan had been expanding its influence for years,
Yeah.
starting with their invasion of Manchuria back in 1931.
Right. I remember learning about that in school. It felt like a distant rumble at the time.
Yeah.
Didn't anyone try to stop them?
The U.S. certainly tried to express its disapproval.
Okay.
They issued the Stimson Doctrine, which basically said they wouldn't recognize any territory acquired by force.
Right.
A diplomatic slap on the wrist, you might say.
But a slap on the wrist doesn't exactly stop a determined aggressor, does it?
Unfortunately not. Japan saw this as a sign of weakness and kept pushing forward.
Wow.
Things escalated dramatically in 1937.
Oh, boy.
When they launched a full-scale invasion of China.
Right.
This led to the horrific events of the Rape of Nanking, a brutal massacre that shocked the world. That's a dark chapter in history, one that's hard to even comprehend.
Absolutely.
What was the U.S. response to this escalation?
They were still hesitant to get directly involved militarily.
Right.
Remember, isolationist sentiment was still strong.
Yeah.
But they did start to impose economic sanctions on Japan.
Okay.
It was a way to signal their disapproval and try to exert some pressure.
So a bit like hitting the brakes but not slamming them on. Did it work?
It backfired, actually.
Yeah.
The sanctions fueled resentment in Japan and pushed them towards even more aggressive actions.
Right.
In 1940, they occupied French Indochina, which really set off alarm bells in Washington.
Okay, this is getting serious.
Yeah.
Japan is on the move, and the U.S. is starting to realize that this isn't just some far-off conflict.
Right.
What did Roosevelt do?
He took a bold step. He imposed an oil embargo on Japan.
Wow, okay.
This was a major escalation because it cut off a vital resource that Japan desperately needed for its war machine.
Wow, that's a power move.
Mhm.
Cutting off their oil supply must have been a huge blow to Japan.
It was a gamble, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's a decision that historians have debated ever since.
Of course.
The Orthodox school sees it as a necessary step to contain Japanese aggression,
Right.
a way to prevent them from joining forces with Germany and Italy.
Okay, makes sense. But I'm guessing not everyone agrees with that interpretation.
You're right. Revisionist historians argue that the oil embargo was a provocation that actually made war almost inevitable.
Really?
They believe it cornered Japan, leaving them with few options other than military action.
So we've got this incredibly complex situation unfolding, tensions rising in Europe, Japan on the march in Asia, and the U.S. trying to navigate this treacherous global landscape. It's like a pressure cooker waiting to explode.
A very apt analogy, and amidst all this, it's easy to forget about the U.S.'s own backyard, Latin America.
Right.
Roosevelt had a completely different approach when it came to dealing with this region.
Right. The Good Neighbor Policy, wasn't that a big departure from previous U.S. policy?
It was a major shift. You see, the U.S. had a long history of interfering in Latin American affairs, often justifying it with the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
Hold on. Can we break that down for a second?
Right.
What exactly was the Roosevelt corollary, and how did it justify intervention?
Good point. The Roosevelt corollary was in addition to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
The corollary took it a step further and claimed the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin American countries to prevent European intervention.
Okay.
It was often used to justify U.S. military actions and economic control in the region.
So basically a way for the U.S. to exert its dominance.
You could say that, but Roosevelt wanted to change this dynamic.
Okay.
He realized that with the growing threat of fascism,
Right.
the U.S. needed stronger relationships with its neighbors, not resentment and mistrust.
It's fascinating how the threat of a common enemy can sometimes bring people together.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what Roosevelt was aiming for with the Good Neighbor Policy.
Okay.
He wanted to foster cooperation and solidarity in the Western Hemisphere.
So what did this good neighbor approach actually look like in practice?
Well, for one thing, the U.S. withdrew its troops from Haiti and Nicaragua, which had been major points of contention.
Okay.
They also ramped up economic and diplomatic cooperation with countries like Mexico and Brazil.
Right.
It was a genuine effort to build trust and create a more united front in the Americas.
Okay, so cooperation in Latin America, confrontation with Japan. It seems like Roosevelt was playing a very different game depending on which part of the world he was dealing with.
It highlights the complexities of foreign policy.
Yeah.
Decisions are rarely black and white.
Right.
They're influenced by all sorts of factors: historical relationships, strategic interests, economic considerations, and even the personalities of the leaders involved.
It's like a giant chessboard with different pieces moving in different directions, and you're trying to anticipate your opponent's next move while also protecting your own interests.
A great way to put it. And speaking of different moves, we can't forget about Canada. Their approach to the war was quite different from both the U.S. and, in some ways, even Britain.
Right? Canada was much quicker to jump into the fray, weren't they?
Yeah.
Why such a different response?
Canada's ties to the British Commonwealth meant that they felt the impact of the European crisis much more immediately.
Right.
When Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, Canada followed suit shortly after.
So for them, it was a matter of loyalty and duty to their allies.
Partly, yes, but it wasn't a simple decision.
Okay.
Canada had its own internal divisions about entering the war.
Oh, really?
Prime Minister Mackenzie King had to tread carefully to maintain national unity.
What kind of divisions?
There were tensions between English-speaking Canadians who were generally more supportive of the war effort
Okay.
and French-speaking Canadians who were more hesitant about getting involved in another European conflict.
So King had to find a way to balance those competing perspectives while also honoring Canada's international commitments.
It was a delicate balancing act, and despite those internal challenges, Canada ended up playing a significant role in the war, contributing troops and providing essential resources to the Allied effort.
It's a reminder that even though Canada is often seen as America's quieter neighbor, they have their own unique history and perspective on global affairs, and their contributions to the war were definitely significant.
Absolutely. And historian Desmond Morton from the National School argues that Canada's participation in World War II actually played a crucial role in shaping their national identity on the world stage.
Wow.
It helped them assert themselves as a more independent and influential player in international affairs.
Okay, so we've got the U.S. slowly but surely being drawn into the conflict in Europe, Canada fully committed to the war effort, and Japan becoming increasingly aggressive in Asia. It feels like all these threads are about to converge into something major.
And converge they did on December 7, 1941. Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
The date which will live in infamy, as Roosevelt so powerfully put it. It's hard to overstate the significance of that event. But before we dive into the ramifications of Pearl Harbor and the U.S.'s entry into the war, let's talk a little bit more about the events leading up to that fateful day.
You're right. To fully grasp the impact of Pearl Harbor, we need to understand the context. We've talked about Japan's growing ambitions in Asia, but what were their specific goals, and how did their actions in the years leading up to the attack contribute to the escalating tensions with the U.S.? Japan had this grand vision for what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Okay.
It was essentially a plan to create a Japanese-dominated economic and political bloc throughout Asia.
Right.
They believed they were destined to rule over this vast region rich in resources and manpower.
So kind of a Japan first policy on a massive scale.
Exactly. They saw themselves as liberating Asia from Western colonialism.
Right.
But in reality, it was all about expanding their own empire and securing access to vital resources like oil, rubber, and minerals.
And this expansionist ambition put them on a collision course with the U.S.
Absolutely. The U.S. had its own interests in Asia, particularly in the Philippines, which was an American territory at the time.
Yeah.
And as Japan's aggression grew, the U.S. saw it as a direct threat to their own strategic and economic interests.
Okay, so we've got this clash of empires brewing, but why did Japan decide to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor? Seems like a drastic move.
It was a calculated risk, but a huge one.
Yeah.
Japan knew that the U.S. had a much larger and more powerful navy.
Right.
They believed that a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, giving them time to consolidate their gains in Southeast Asia and the Pacific.
So it was a preemptive strike hoping to knock the U.S. out of the game before they could even react.
Precisely. And it worked, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
The attack on December 7, 1941 was devastating. They sank or damaged numerous battleships and killed thousands of Americans.
It's hard to imagine the shock and horror that must have rippled through the nation that day.
It was a national trauma, but it also proved to be a colossal miscalculation on Japan's part.
So it seemed like a tactical victory.
Because they underestimated the American resolve before Pearl Harbor, there was still significant debate in the U.S. about entering the war. But the attack unified the country like nothing else could.
Yeah, it's often said that Pearl Harbor was the end of American isolationism.
And that's a pretty accurate assessment. The attack galvanized public opinion. Suddenly, isolationism seemed naive and dangerous. Roosevelt was able to declare war on Japan with almost unanimous backing from Congress.
It's amazing how one event can so drastically alter the course of history. It really shows how even seemingly distant conflicts can have a ripple effect across the globe.
It's a lesson that remains relevant today. We live in an interconnected world where events on one side of the planet can have profound consequences for everyone.
So Pearl Harbor brings the U.S. into the war full force. How did this change the dynamics of the conflict?
It was a game changer. The U.S., with its massive industrial capacity and military potential, tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. Their entry into the war ultimately proved decisive in defeating the Axis powers.
So in a way, Japan's attempt to knock the U.S. out of the fight actually had the opposite effect. It brought them in with a vengeance.
It's a classic case of strategic miscalculation. They underestimated the power of American resolve and the potential consequences of their actions.
It's a reminder that in the grand scheme of history, actions have consequences often unintended ones.
Exactly, and it underscores the importance of understanding history, not just as a collection of facts and dates, but as a complex web of interconnected events, decisions, and personalities that continue to shape our world today.
I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating and pivotal period in history. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the rise of isolationism in the U.S. to the events that led to their entry into World War II.
It's a story full of twists and turns, strategic blunders, and ultimately the triumph of democracy over tyranny. And hopefully our discussion has provided you, our listener, with a better understanding of this complex era and its lasting legacy.
Thanks for joining us on this journey back in time. We hope you've gained some new insights and a deeper appreciation for the forces that have shaped our world.
And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the present and preparing for the future.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.